Welcome to Intelligence Conversations, a podcast from the Global Intelligence Knowledge Network, where intelligence, national security, and geopolitics are explored through in-depth conversations with experts, analysts, and practitioners from around the world. Your host is Neil Bisson, a retired intelligence officer with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and director of the Global Intelligence Knowledge Network. Intelligence Conversations brings listeners informed, open-source, intelligence-driven discussions on the threats, trends, and strategic realities shaping Canada and the world. In today's episode, Neil is joined by Dennis Molinaro, an intelligence researcher, academic, and historian whose work focuses on understanding the hidden forces shaping Canada's national security landscape. Dennis is the author of the new book Under Assault: Interference and Espionage in China's Secret War Against Canada, a deeply researched examination of how the People's Republic of China conducts intelligence, influence, and interference operations targeting Canadian institutions, politics, economy, and society. In today's conversation, Neil and Dennis explore Dennis's background and what drew him to intelligence and Canadian history, as well as the research process behind Under Assault, and why this book is especially relevant in today's political and economic climate. They examine Canada's long-standing separation of national security from trade and diplomacy, how recent trade decisions on electric vehicle and agricultural negotiations intersect with espionage and foreign interference risk, and what these developments mean for Canada's relationship with China, the United States, and with our other Five Eyes partners. The discussion also dives into transnational repression, diaspora manipulation, the legacy of the two Michaels, the intelligence obligations placed on Chinese companies, and the growing role of disinformation in shaping tensions between Canada and the United States. Finally, this episode confronts a critical issue: the lack of an intelligence culture in Canadian political life, and what Canadians themselves can do to push for stronger awareness, accountability, and protection of national security. Are you ready? Then, let's start this intelligence conversation.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Intelligence Conversations. I'm your host, Neil Bisson, a Canadian Security Intelligence Service intelligence officer, retired, of course, and I do this podcast regularly with intelligence professionals who have moved into other areas. And today I am fortunate enough to have Dennis Molinaro, the author of Under Assault, as well as the author of Bridge in the Parks, if I got that correct.
You got that correct, yeah.
Excellent, excellent. And today we're going to be talking about his latest book. He's also a former intelligence analyst with Canadian Intelligence, and he is a professor at the Ontario Tech University. Did I get that right?
You got that right, yep.
There you go, there you go. I'm batting 1,000 already. So, Dennis, thank you very much for coming on to the show. As I've told many other people, the reason why I do this podcast is I'm trying to share as much about national security and intelligence with other Canadians so they get a better appreciation for some of the hard work that happens and the importance of what it's all about. And your most recent book, Under Assault, I think is probably on a lot of people's minds, especially what just happened recently with our Prime Minister going to Beijing and setting up a new deal. And so before we get into all of that, though, maybe you can give our listeners just a little bit of a background about how you got started with intelligence and, you know, what drew you to it and how you got into authoring books after that.
Sure. So I started into that world actually through academia. So it was really through doing intelligence history and being a historian of intelligence history, international relations, and even within Canada as well, Canadian history, that I found that interest. And I found that there was a natural pull there. So once I finished my PhD, then I started looking at opportunities, and that seemed to fit, joining up into the intelligence industry and world. And so, and it's what I found is that my skill set just lended really well. I mean, the skill set you use for researching and, you know, mining through all kinds of documents and trying to figure out what things mean and trying to find mysteries in history. I mean, it lines up very nicely, I would say, with the intelligence world. And so, but I found, you know, the opportunity to start teaching full time, which is something I've always wanted to do as well. That came up, and it was a good opportunity. I couldn't pass it up. I moved back into the academic world and back to writing books.
Well, we got to thank you for providing that expertise that you did on the intelligence side of things, and then now bringing it into the world of academia and authoring some amazing books. It's amazing what you had mentioned about the fact that research involved with these types of books that you have written. I noticed that in some of the comments that were made by individuals who have read the book, that they have talked about how meticulous the information and how meticulous the research was. And I think that's definitely a real compliment to you and to the intelligence industry writ large, that you have individuals like yourself who are looking at this academically, objectively, and trying to find the information to, as you say, find these mysteries in history. So, that's some incredible stuff. So let's get into the book. You This book was how long did it take you to kind of cobble this one together?
Let's see. It took about probably I would say about 2 years, I would say, or so. I
Okay.
mean, it's one of those things where um, as I was writing it, things kept coming out in
Hmm.
terms of news. So the
Right.
inquiry was going on, right? So as the
Hmm.
inquiry was going on, you have to kind of leave space for like, okay, well, the historical part was easy to write. It was really once I got to the conclusion that
Hmm.
that was the part that had to keep getting updated because you look what happened. Not only did the inquiry finish,
Right.
the Hogan Free finish, that is. But Donald Trump came into office.
Hmm.
And so once that happened, it seemed like I was updating my conclusion every week with something new. So it was a non-stop. So I was like, oh boy, when am I going to be able to release this?
It's
So
kind of
that
a
was,
double-edged sword. You got a plethora
yeah,
of information, but at the same time, you have to keep
yeah.
updating what you've already written, I guess.
The history stuff was easy to write because it's there. It's happened. It's done. It's when I
Right.
got to the very end where I was trying to keep it as current as I could that
Hmm.
the goalposts kept moving on me.
So going back to like the inquiry, and was there anything that was happening over the last couple of years that was kind of a catalyst that kind of said to you, that spoke to you and said, you know what, I really need to write a book on foreign interference and what's happening between China and Canada, what's been going on for decades?
I would say, the calculus to do it was really because I found that people just didn't understand.
Right.
When they were discussing things in media and they were the way, China was being discussed, they just didn't really understand
Hmm.
the relationship long term. And so when I started digging into what was out there existing, just to try to get a sense of what's been done,
Hmm.
and it kind of confirmed my sense was that Canada and always had this position of separating
Hmm.
security from trade
Right.
and from diplomacy.
Hmm.
And nowhere I would think is that more present than with China.
Hmm.
And you see, so I'm looking at the diplomatic text or the history that's been done, and security encompasses maybe a page, maybe 2 page of some of these books.
Hmm.
And I thought, okay, well, there's a need here. There's a need
Hmm.
here to update the way we look at our relationship with China over the decades. And I think back to intelligence historians in Britain who were writing essentially to make the point that diplomatic history and intelligence history shouldn't be separated,
Hmm.
and I think that spoke to me pretty clearly when it came to China that this was a need that had to be done so that people understand things more fully and have a point of reference, whether you're in government or whether you're in civil society and just wanting to understand the more complexities of that relationship and the history of it. I thought this was a much needed book that had to be done.
Hmm. And I agree with you 100%. Was there anything that, as you were writing the book, that you came across that you were surprised about, or that, you're from the intelligence profession, you've dealt with these types of issues before, you've talked about this kind of stuff, you've seen a lot of other people talk about this kind of stuff. Was there anything that you came across that really shocked you, or that you felt, wow, I didn't think that even with my background, that it was this bad or this was happening? Was there anything that kind of caught you off guard that way?
I would say, we often in public life here, when it came to dealing with China, we saw a big turn, I would say, come 2019 once the Michaels were detained,
Right.
and that really changed the calculus of how everyone was looking at China.
Hmm.
Um, but when I started looking back in the history, and I started, reading more about this, I started to see how so much just seemed similar to the
Hmm.
present.
Hmm.
And so it was quite shocking in that regard, especially when I got to the recognition of China.
Right.
And when I got to that story of getting into the documents of how China was recognized, and you start, we hear in the news all the time about, now at least, about how different Chinese communities experience transnational repression, and that makes the news pretty often about how they have to deal and grapple with this.
Hmm.
But when I went back in the historical records, and during that time period of when Canada recognizes China, and it appears from the documents that I found that this was part of something um, more actually related to foreign influence against Canada,
Hmm.
through Paul Lynn. Um, I also found historical documents from the press about how the Chinese Canadian community was afraid that they were going to be targeted for
Hmm.
for repression by the PRC state once that recognition happened. And
Right.
the,
Right.
the documents were full of that within the ethnic media,
Hmm.
and it was quite illuminating, I'd say.
So let's go back through some of the more recent history when it comes to some of the concerns that we've had about China. You look at the microbiology lab in Winnipeg. You look at two individuals that, basically took what they could, provided to the Chinese government, and then got out of town. You've got multiple Chinese cyber attacks through, I guess you'd call it cutout hacking groups. Um, you've got Chinese police stations in different parts of Canada that have been identified. So we're talking about, the repression of the diaspora. And then, you talk about other concerns that the Five Eyes have. You talk about the two Michaels. You talk about Huawei and the 5G network, and all of these things that have come to the attention of intelligence professionals over the years, and the warnings that have been given to the Canadian government that this is happening, this continues to happen, and there's no reason for us to believe that it's going to stop happening. And then now you bring it up to just what happened over the weekend, and you've got the Prime Minister going to Beijing and sealing the deal, or trying to, I don't know if he's doing his best, art of the deal impersonation, but making it look like, hey, listen, I got a really good trade deal out of this. And individuals potentially like ourselves saying, hey, well, wait a minute, maybe you got a good deal, but there might be some other concerns. So maybe you can, just talk a little bit from your perspective in the book, where there's kind of a deviation here. We talked about a little earlier, deviation between trade and national security or intelligence.
Yeah, the deviation that you're talking about, um, and that I discuss in the book, and the book is meant to address, you could
Hmm.
see it live happening this past week.
Right.
You could see it live happening in real time on the news as Prime Minister Carney did this China visit, where trade and economics is completely detached from any of the security concerns Canada might have with China and does have with China, to
Hmm.
the point where the Prime Minister was not even interested in going back to his original statement of China being the largest threat to Canada,
Hmm.
uh, and not even uttering that, because it has to be kept separate. And that's the problem with how Canada is doing this kind of outreach with China, with the PRC, because it is dividing these things up. And the Americans don't do this.
Hmm.
There isn't going to, you don't see them engaging with China and all of a sudden ignoring their commitments to Taiwan. That doesn't
Right.
happen.
Hmm.
They, even if they're ambiguous on Taiwan, they are not in terms of supplying it with military equipment and weapons, and they don't recall people who are in Taiwan because the government is visiting China.
Hmm.
Uh, and part of the problem, I think, with Canada and the way its approaches, and part of the reason perhaps that it does this, is because addressing that security element requires action,
Hmm.
requires doing something. Whereas if it can just sometimes I get the tendency that there's an attempt to just want to speak to it, and if we speak to it and if we acknowledge it verbally, then that's sufficient when it isn't.
Right.
We
Right.
need
Right. It's
concrete
like
action.
the Harry Potter saying Voldemort, it's like, no, don't talk about that. Don't say that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It has to be addressed, but you saw it live,
Yeah.
and that's part of the problem.
Hmm. And from my perspective, I mean, I've been covering this a little bit too. One of the biggest concerns that I've had is that even when you see a spark, a glimmer of hope that the Canadian government is kind of getting their heads wrapped around the fact that you can't have diplomacy, economy, military influence, all these other things that are important for your own sovereignty without addressing those issues. And, from my personal perspective, I saw this as, okay, well, if you're going to go over and make a deal, you don't necessarily have to capitulate when it comes to certain things. And, you can still say, hey, we want to trade with you, but at the same time, we're just not going to trade on certain things. And, seeing 49,000 Chinese vehicles come into Canada, that's a drop in the bucket, and China probably doesn't even care. But to them, it's telling the rest of the world, hey, listen, we're going to do what we want to do, and we got our foot in the door here on this one. And it kind of, how do you think, I know your previous book, Bridge in the Five Parks?
The bridge in the parks, yeah,
Sorry,
wasn't
Bridge in
it?
the Parks.
Yeah.
That deals with the Five Eyes. How do you feel, or how do you think Five Eyes will start to respond to this? Okay, well now, we've all kind of said, hey, listen, we've got to be cautious of Chinese technology because they can use it for their own purposes. Every company that's owned in China is partly owned by the Chinese government, and it's basically the law to say that if we want to take any of your information, use it for our own intelligence purposes, we will. So how does Canada deal with our Five Eye partners and say, hey, listen, we're with you against China when it comes to how they're trying to over influence things, how they're trying to be involved in our politics, how they're trying to spy on us, how they're trying to take our technology. But then we say, okay, we're going to let 50,000 vehicles in, like for the first year, and then bring it up to 70,000
Mhm.
over the next five. So,
Mhm. Mhm. There's a lot of missteps, I think, that happened with this deal. A number of them. So first, I would say on the outset, we don't appear to have addressed anything in relation to the security aspect when it comes to China.
right.
There's no foreign interference registry. It's languished in legislation. It's kind of stalled there. There's no foreign interference commissioner. No one has been prosecuted under the new laws that were passed with Bill C-70.
Hmm.
So there's been next to nothing that's been done in terms of, at least that we know of. So that's important because if we don't address those things that China has been doing presently, then we go over there and try to establish relations without actually establishing that these things that you have been doing are not acceptable to us,
Right.
and that come with some type of cost imposed.
Hmm.
So we imposed no cost here, and then went to the PRC, and it's the type two things that happened. It's the type of deal that transpired, and it's also what happened alongside that deal. There was no reason I felt for the type of romanticized language that the prime minister was using when it
Hmm.
came to the relationship with China. There was no gain to be using the new world order that we're going to be in and the wonderful
Hmm.
partner, the type of partnership celebration that he was echoing on in terms of or portraying when it came to China.
Hmm.
This that was unnecessary. There that doesn't connect to trade at all.
Hmm.
Um, why announce some type of partnership or cooperation between law enforcement? How would that work when we have the PRC actively looking to harass and get people back to China
Hmm.
and punish them for speaking out? How would that kind of cooperation take place?
Hmm.
And that's not linked to trade.
Right.
The idea of no visas for people entering China, that trade either. So there's other things that materialized over the course of this visit
Hmm.
that had nothing to do with the economics. So that's another mistake.
Hmm.
Was diving headfirst into all these things without understanding, the ramifications. But in terms of your the other part of your question there with the Five Eyes, the biggest concern that we're going to have is with the leader of that group, which is the United States,
Right.
um, because it's not simply that we're bringing over PRC EVs.
Hmm.
EVs are a strategic asset, strategic technology for the PRC. It is
Hmm.
heavily state subsidized. As you
Hmm.
point out correctly, companies are obligated to assist the PRC state with intelligence collection
Hmm.
if they're so required. We don't know where any of that data that the EVs will be collecting is what's going to happen with it. It's going to go to China. It's a
Right.
PRC owned company. It will go back. There's
Hmm.
going to be updates that are registered to these EVs. These EVs are going to plug into Canadian infrastructure. They're going to
Hmm.
connect to Canadian internet. They're going to connect to your cell phones that when you
Hmm.
operate them. They're not
Hmm.
going to be allowed in the United States. I'm pretty sure on that one.
Hmm.
And it's what it does is it is think of it as establishing a beachhead within
Yeah.
Canada.
Hmm.
Because once you start getting the brand recognition, once you
Hmm.
start trying to get people using it, then more investment is going to come from the PRC. Now, the government might have blinders on and say that's great, but what it's going to do is insert PRC technology and parts into the North American supply chains.
Right.
Precisely what the Americans have been so upset about is Canada
Hmm.
being used as a dumping ground for Chinese goods to get into the US market and escape their tariffs.
Yeah.
So, this is a far larger problem that's going to materialize than I think
Hmm.
Canada was willing to acknowledge.
And, from the perspective of Canada has previously stood up for certain things like, they banned Hikvision, which is
Yeah.
a closed circuit television or camera maker. They're making sure that it's not in any government facility because they know that there's a possibility that this information is being shared with the Chinese government and it's a breach of our own security. Um, Yet you talk about EVs, and I look at it from the perspective not only are we collecting all of this information, but now you're getting uh, vehicles that are being plugged into critical infrastructure. Like
Yes.
you've got chargers, you've got, and you're going to be buying if you buy a BYD car, you're going to be buying a BYD charger for your home, which basically plugs into our own critical infrastructure. So this is another thing that we need to be concerned about, but yet we're seeing our politicians basically turn a blind eye to this and say, well, it's good for trade, so we're just going to go ahead and do it. And you touched on another point too, where if Canada continues to decide to open up the market to Chinese EVs or Chinese vehicles, and now all of a sudden we're building Chinese vehicles the same way we do with Japanese vehicles or with vehicles from Europe in Canada, we're basically setting up, like you said, that beachhead that says, okay, well, now you can just start implementing your own parts into whatever other infrastructure we decide we're going to say yes to. So these are major issues that we're all dealing with that, people from the national security and intelligence perspective are looking at, just kind of shaking their head, going, why did this all happen? But what do you think, with what you've written in your book already and what's out there, what do you think most Canadians are just missing out on? Like, are they being duped? Are they being basically told by the Canadian government, hey, listen, don't worry about that. We're going to get trade off the ground and everyone's going to be happy because we're all going to be making more money? Or is it one of these things where even the politicians and the policymakers aren't getting it?
I think part of the problem, one, is looking at China as if it's just any other country that can
Right.
just replace trade with the United States. As if it's equivalent to any other nation that, well, it's a big country and we can replace that trade.
Hmm.
You are never going to, so people have to understand by virtue of the fact
Hmm.
of where we are in terms of geography, we
Hmm.
are there, we only share one land border, and that is with the United
Yeah.
States.
Yeah.
There are oceans between us and
Hmm.
everyone else, and the United States between us and everyone south of us.
Hmm.
So that is a basic reality that we are never going to get around. Along with that, we have so much in terms of shared economies and culture that and military and interoperability between them and
Hmm.
sharing agreements of all kinds from military to intelligence. Nothing is going to immediately replace any of that,
Hmm.
if ever. Because the reality is there's been prime ministers, speaking as a historian, going back decades, who have always wanted to diversify from the United States and abandon that
Hmm.
because of how long it would take with the effort involved. So the difference between country one and country two in terms of our trade is almost $1 trillion in
Hmm.
value.
Hmm.
So this is not something that is going to be an easy fix. And if anyone is promising an easy fix, well, they're looking, in my opinion, they're looking for votes.
Yeah.
But going back now to this issue of what do Canadians need to know? So one, they need to know that this is not any other country.
Mm-hmm.
This is an adversary of the West. And the book pretty well demonstrates that,
Mm-hmm.
that because of China's activities over the decades when it comes to Canada and the United States, they have a clear goal in mind. It's their national interests. It's their desires to supplant the United States and the West. That's their interest.
Mm-hmm.
So people need to, one, recognize that. And I think another problem that we have within Canada is a cultural problem.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, I mean, we don't have a really well-developed intelligence culture in this country.
Right.
It very often is politicians, I don't think, understand it. I don't think a lot of people who are not working in intelligence and government really understand the mechanisms behind it, its purpose in forming policy and statecraft.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have a cultural problem within government, I think, from what I saw going back decades researching this in the archives, that there is a mindset principally focused on trade that does not account for anything else as a major fact. If anything, if security is introduced into trade, it becomes something as a problem,
right,
that can interfere in trade, and that's how it's regarded.
Mm-hmm.
But really, people have to understand that, it's China that has linked intelligence and security with economics. The
Right.
principal reason we have to deal with economic security issues now, Canada and the United States, is because China invests so heavily in creating national champions, because it ends up doing things like forcing companies to work for their intelligence apparatus through legislation. So they've linked these things. They've done this to the point where we have to respond.
Right. So, along that same line, some of the more recent articles that I've talked about from the Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up have dealt with the infiltration of China into different sectors, including the military. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because over the last, several months since, Trump got into office in the United States, we've been saying, listen, we really need to bulk up our own military so that we can show that we have the ability to protect our own sovereignty. Do you see China looking at Canada saying, let's get a better idea of what's going on with them militarily? And how do you think that China will try to infiltrate or collect more information from, the Canadian military? Because we've seen it just recently with the Hydro-Quebec situation, where there was an individual who was providing information to the Chinese government. So we know that they're obviously interested in our infrastructure and what they can do to either dismantle it or disrupt it. Now that Canada is trying to put more time and effort into their own military, how do you see China responding to that? And what do you think they'll start doing in order to make sure that their own goals are taken care of?
I mean, I think they would probably continue on the path that they've already been on, that we already know about, where they, seek to try to influence individuals and work their way into positions where they could collect more information. I think something that they will also probably seek to do is continue to drive wedges on American issues. I totally see them as a state that would really try to take advantage of and heighten this idea of the Americans being a threat to Canadian sovereignty, and really try to amplify that message through disinformation and through other types of misinformation, to really kind of capture that sentiment and spread it. And so I really see a lot of that whole, I see them trying to amplify that in order to benefit themselves. And then as they amplify that message, swoop in to try to appear to be the panacea for our relationship with the United States and our problems with it. That China will offer the solution. So amplify the conflict, the division, in order to present yourself as the solution. Right.
Or maybe they'll just do a huge discount on any EV purchased by any military officer.
Yeah, and that brings in another question, right? Because if once these things arrive, what are the restrictions that are going to be placed on them?
Exactly. Exactly.
We see it in the UK already. The UK has already set down restrictions in terms of
Mhm.
you can't drive these vehicles within 2 kilometers of some government institutions.
Mhm.
They're advising people not to connect their phone to them. These are
Mhm.
probably also going to be vehicles that are going to be equipped with China's AI. So that's also going to be another factor.
Mhm.
You're going to be helping teach the PRC's AI systems.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sometimes there's
Yeah.
problems here.
It's everywhere you look, you just see there's going to be another issue with this. But unfortunately, you and I and other individuals from national security and the intelligence professions are just like, I'm not sure why this is all coming together. But what do you think we can do as Canadians, as former intelligence professionals, as individuals that are still interested and concerned about these issues, to get the message across so that politicians, government of Canada can start to adopt some safer practices and policies? Like what can we do about this? I mean, we don't just want to admire the problem. What's the next step?
I think the next step is to continue what we're doing right now, which is talking.
Hmm.
I think talking, educating, speaking out, publicizing the issues and the problems are central to having some kind of lasting, meaningful change take place. Education, essentially. And I mean, I'm an
Right.
educator,
Right.
so I mean, at the core, I think that there's a matter of educating the public is of critical importance. I think. I mean, that book, the book Under Assault, is meant to be a reference guide for people, no matter where they're coming from, so that they can reference the issue and the issues in the past that we've had with China, so they can actually orient better policy for the present and the future. That
Hmm.
they can, with the public taking more interest in these things, it's holding leaders accountable,
Yeah.
and setting the direction of where the public would like things to go, rather
Hmm.
than where they're being taken or led.
Right. So, can you give us some insight into what you might be working on next?
Actually, well, there's two things that I'm kind of dabbling in now. One is actually a big deviation, which is fictional work,
Oh, excellent.
involving sci-fi and fantasy. So that's a whole
Oh,
other genre that I'm playing with.
okay.
But also, safety culture is something else that I'm looking
Okay.
at, and the emergence of how we got to a place where we currently are, where everything, how children walking to school is considered unsafe, and how
Mm,
did we start GPSing them, and how did we start moving on just general more restrictions on society and life,
right,
and
right.
where that's going to take us.
Yeah, it is kind of scary because I mean, we talk about all of these technological advancements that we have, and a lot of them are focused on cameras is a good example. I mean, the reason why everybody has a doorbell camera right now is because they're afraid someone's going to steal a package off their front, or
Yep.
something's going to happen, or who knows, maybe they'll upload it to YouTube and it'll become a
Yep.
sensation and go viral. But that sounds like some pretty interesting. Looking forward to seeing that kind of
Yep.
stuff for sure. Yeah. So you got a lot of stuff going on.
I
Can you
got
tell
you.
our listeners where's the best place that they could get access to your book? Are you doing any book signings coming up? Are you going to be doing any tours, any discussions?
So I'm always kind of looking for more. Those things kind of happen on the fly when the book signings emerge. But you can get the book anywhere. It's
Mm-hmm.
available on Amazon. It's available on Indigo. Any bookstore carries it.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty widely out there, so widely available for anybody who wants it.
Well, as a former intelligence professional, I highly recommend that people pick this book up if they want a better understanding of what's been happening between China and Canada for so many decades, where we're going, what some of the concerns are. I highly recommend, and I will leave a link in the description of this intelligence conversation so that people can get access to the book. Dennis, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about this, to help our listeners get a better understanding of what some of the concerns are. Please keep up the good work. If we get an opportunity, hopefully we'll have another chance for you to come on to the show, talk a little bit more about what's going on. And I know I do a couple other shows, Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap Up and Spies Like Us. And I'm sure my friends Al Trudenick and Phil Gursky would love to have an opportunity to have a conversation with you about your latest book. And you can pepper you with questions, and that way you don't just have to listen to my voice. So that's a good thing too. But thank you again for coming on to the show. and just doing what you're doing. Please keep it up. That intelligence culture, like we all talk about, needs to get out there. People need to have a better understanding of why this is affecting their daily lives and what they can do about it. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. It was really fun.
All right.
That concludes this episode of Intelligence Conversations. Thank you for listening and for spending your time with us. If you found today's discussion valuable, in-depth, and thought-provoking, be sure to check out Neil's weekly podcast, Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up, where he delivers regular intelligence-driven analysis of the latest developments in national security, espionage, terrorism, foreign interference, and global affairs. Each week, Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up breaks down the stories shaping the modern threat environment, connecting open-source reporting to real-world intelligence context and strategic insight. If you enjoy and appreciate this work, you can support the channel through Buzzsprout. A link is provided in the description. Your support helps sustain the research, analysis, and production that go into every episode. You can also support the show by leaving a comment, sharing this episode with others, and helping grow the audience interested in serious, informed national security discussion. Thank you again for listening. And as always, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.